This happened when I was about 18, and hanging out at my friend Joanne's house with some other school friends. I can't quite remember how we got onto the subject, but towards the end of the evening, Joanne thought it would be fun to perform a seance. Joanne and her family were from Cape Town, South Africa, and had a deep-rooted interest in the spiritual, or at least that's what Joanne made out to us. With the lights off and candles lit, we sat around a table with cards fanned out at the edge. Each card has letters arranged from the alphabet in A to Z, and we placed a shot glass in the middle. Joanne started speaking out to the spirits in Afrikaans, and I remember pulling a face and rolling my eyes, but it was too dark for anyone to see and take offense. At the time, I was an insufferable, enlightened, atheist teenage dork. You know the type, basically a cringy 4chan edgelord who thinks any form of spirituality or religion is beneath them and their superior intellect. It started mundane enough. A few questions were asked and the shot glass were resting on our fingers and started to move to and fro until eventually someone asked the spirit if they were associated with anyone in the room. The shot glass moved directly towards me. Incredulous, I asked the spirit, "If you're associated with me, then what's my mother's maiden name?" My eyes fixated on the letters that spelled out her maiden name, Jones, but the glass started to spell out something different. First the glass went to T, then H, then O. I thought it was BS, but I was completely wrong, and I was struck by a horrific realization. When my mum was 6 months old, her biological father died of a heart attack, and a year after that, she took her stepfather's name. I completely forgot, and in that moment I was expecting the glass to read out the maiden name she had for the majority of her life, but it was actually spelling that of her original maiden name, Thompson. It was a fact so trivial that I barely remembered it myself. It was something I'd never even spoken with in my family, as it happened so long ago. It would be hard to believe that any of my friends would know this historic piece of my family's history that occurred 20 years before I was even born, with nonetheless knowing how it was spelt out in front of my very eyes. My school friends and I wouldn't talk about anything deeper than video games and tits at that age, yet there was no way I ever mentioned this to any of them. It's not like one of my pot-smoking loser friends had a copy of my mum's birth certificate, and none of them had ever met anyone else in my family. There was literally no way any of them could have known this. Before I could contemplate this for too long, or ask any other questions to my ghostly associate, Joanne's mum came into the room and turned the lights on, and with a thick South African accent, shouts something like, "Bloody hell, Joanne, stop messing around with this silly crap," and put a definitive stop to the proceedings. Of course, at the time I played it off as a prank, but the more I thought about it, the more my mind wandered. Did something actually paranormal happen that night? I know it's nothing dramatic or exciting. I didn't see an apparition or a cryptid, but unlike 90% of the stuff you hear on the internet, this experience is actually true, and something that to this day I can't explain. I would love your thoughts on the matter. When I was in the Air Force, I went off base with my roommate. Unbeknownst to me, some of my other friends in my dorm had pulled out a Ouija board. They had connected with a spirit and asked a few questions. However, the group didn't trust that someone wasn't pushing the planchette around. My good buddy Lewis asked a question of the spirit. "Where is Eric?" Lewis was the only one who knew I was off base, so he would know if someone was pulling the planchette around and forcing an answer. The planchette moved around the board, giving 4 numbers. The group were confused as they thought about what the 4 numbers could be. While they discussed what the 4 numbers could mean, one of the guys that was observing, named Newbury, said, "Hey, I'm gonna head up and get some drinks from my room." As he was heading out the door, he realized, oh, those 4 numbers are the same as his room number. Everyone joked about me being in Newbury's room, trying on his underwear or something. Newbury left their first floor room to head up the 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor to go to his room. I had just gotten back from my night out and was still kind of early for a Saturday night, so I stopped at the front CQ to check in and talk to some other friends, and made my way back to my dorm room. As my roommate unlocked our door, I noticed my neighbouring dorm mate's light was on. The light was showing under his door. I knocked on his door and called out his name. "Hey, Newbury!" My roommate realised Newbury wasn't answering and said, "He's asleep." I don't know what got into me, but I said that I had to see him, so I knocked again. "Hey, Newbury, open up." Right then, from down the hall, I hear Newbury's voice yell, "What the hell?" At the end of the hall is an emergency staircase that is the back way of getting down to the 1st floor if we're in a hurry. Newbury was in disbelief and swore a number of times as he walked up to me standing in front of his door. He told me, "Don't move." He unlocked his door, went into his room, grabbed some sodas and said, "Holy crap," and with excitement closed and locked his door. He grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Come on." We quickly went back down the emergency stairwell, down 2 flights of stairs and across the room where my buddies were sitting around a Ouija board. Newbury knocked and slowly opened the door, keeping me back so they couldn't see me. He entered the room saying, "You ain't gonna believe this," and pulled me into the room. My friends were looking at me like they'd seen a ghost. Before anyone could say anything, Newbury said out loud, "He was standing in front of my door." In my family, my grandmother and my sister have had lots of paranormal encounters, whether that be in dreams, looking at pictures, or person to spirit. Many people in my family have stories. This story was a few years ago. It's not my personal experience, but my little cousin. B was 2 years old when she had her first encounter with the unliving. Her parents were the most unfortunate, and they moved from duplex to duplex. Her parents, though, finally found a home to live in. It was a mobile home with not much known about its past. They just signed some paperwork, got the keys and moved in, and began getting comfortable in their new home. It was peaceful, up until B started talking to something. When her parents would ask her what, she'd always say she was speaking to her friend Bella. The thing is, B didn't know anyone called Bella. Now you're probably thinking kids have wild imaginations. She was only 2, and had never shown signs of having a big imagination. Eventually it just became a thing for B to talk to her friend. That is until B would complain to her parents that Bella was choking her. At this point, B's parents begin to get a little concerned and went to B's grandma for help. Her grandma was very spiritual and had a lot of experiences with those who have passed on. She set up a ghost box in the house and started communicating with the spirits. At once they started communicating and they got some answers. Then B's father got mysterious scratches that would appear out of nowhere, and B would curl up in a ball in the middle of the floor, which was very unusual. She was normally the happiest girl in the world. Now they were getting answers on the ghost box. Some of the answers were fallen angel, laughter, Michigan, and allegedly that the boy next door had taken his life. After the dangerous entity, they ended up moving B, and she was happy once again. This next story is my own. When I was around 4, my parents had recently divorced. I would stay at my grandma's house where my father lived. When I was young, my imagination was not big, and I'd never watched any scary movies, not even Goosebumps. But I had developed realistic nightmares of a man of around 6'2" who would stand over and taunt me, saying he had ended the lives of certain family members, and he was going to do the same to me and my pets. Eventually I was terrified of sleeping and began sleeping in my grandma's room. Not even that was safe though, because randomly in the middle of the night, I would see a crying lady in a long blue dress with black hair run out of my grandma's bathroom screaming. After I saw her, I'd scream and cry, and my grandma would wake up. Since I moved, I hadn't seen them. There's another story I'd like to share from a family reunion. We went to a huge church school. Every family reunion, it was 3 stories, and it had a little window that peered into the lower floors on the upper level. Me, my sister, and a few of my cousins decided to sneak upstairs where we weren't allowed and to be and explore. We found a music room where we would hear something so cliché, a piano playing some weird song. When we went in, a boy was playing it. It was weird because no students or staff were allowed on school grounds at the time. He ran out of the room, so we chased him down a hall. Then he was gone. There was nowhere for him to go. Down that hall, he just kind of disappeared. We never found out anything more about him. This next story is my grandma's. When she was younger, she had a child called Misha. After she had Misha, she started having violent night terrors about a baby around the age of 2 that was deceased. It had water running out of its mouth and it was blue. She would wake up screaming, and her husband would have to comfort her. She would scream, "Misha! She was gone! I saw it!" She kept Misha away from any open water from that day on, but continued to have the same night terror. Well, Misha grew up into an adult and had 2 kids, Kinley and Ava. By that point her nightmares calmed down, and she felt better knowing Misha was safe. Until one day Misha brought her children and sisters to the lake for a beach day. Kinley was 6, Ava was 3. Misha was making snacks when she realized, "Where's Ava?" She looked around the beach and felt a sharp pain in her chest. That's when she went into shock. Ava was dragged back to the shore by 2 12-year-old girls. Misha wasn't able to comprehend what was happening until everything snapped and she did CPR. Kinley watched the whole thing until Misha's sister went in to distract her. My grandma was called, and Ava was airlifted to hospital. It turns out that my grandma saw Ava. Ava looked exactly like the child who she saw in her dream all those years ago. And don't worry, she didn't pass away, because I'm Ava. I was legally dead for a few minutes there, but I'm okay now. Just got some brain damage. After the whole incident, while I was in the hospital, I was talking to my grandma. She told me I said I saw mermaids, and that they tried to help me. But when I described what the mermaids looked like, I described my family members who had passed before I was born, that I have no pictures of, and haven't seen. At least not then. When I was around the age of 10, I was living with my mother and her ex. The house was built about 100 years ago. It was a 2-story mint green house and was beautiful. It had a garden and a big backyard, and we kept the original door as decoration. It was a bit out of shape, but it was still livable and cheap, and it had the perfect neighborhood, other than a few unsavory characters who were, let's just say, into children who lived down the road. But it was next to the community park and police station. I had a room in the attic that was redesigned into 2 rooms, a huge playroom with stairs, and a chandelier in my room, which was small with no cooling or heating, and bugs got into my lighting which made the power in my room go out, but I made it work. I got really comfortable living in my small room, and decorated it with shelves, a homemade dartboard, posters, and a huge old-fashioned dresser that took up most of the space in my room. Well, one day, my mother's ex got mad at me and took away my door, so I could just peer into the darkness of the huge room outside of mine. It frightened me. It was night and I was on the phone, and I heard a noise coming from the other room. So I looked out into the other room, and fingers were wrapped around the door frame. I sat there paralyzed for 10 minutes, with tears streaming down my face, until I started screaming and they went away. And one day, when I was sitting on the couch in my living room, my youngest sister ran out of her room crying, saying a monster ran across her room. She was too young to have an imagination like that, and I would hear a small, "Hello," whispered in my ear most nights, which made me lose a lot of sleep. At some point I fell into a deep depression that seemed to make everything worse, like the spirits had a hold of me. Me and my sister eventually bought a ghost box, which we could hear a little boy saying, "Sorry, Mummy." We did some research and found out that a lady had gone insane in the house because she'd had miscarriages and ended her life. The place, most likely where she did it, was the attic. Those are my stories. I hope you enjoyed mine and my family's encounters with the paranormal. I was in my late 30s by this point, and thought I had my moments of strangeness in my life. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened for a long time. During this time I had met the gal who would become my wife, as well as other great friends doing live theatre in a local community theatre. One such friend was a major gamer and reignited my love for Dungeons and Dragons. I was also unemployed and attending college, so I had quite a bit of free time, and between the two of us, I had gone from a weekly gaming group to several weekly gaming groups. It was a great and amazing time in my life, and there was a sense of renewal after dealing with depression and anxiety for many years prior, and my friends and I would hang out until the early hours of the morning, often walking around the block or into my friend's property. My friends and I often bonded over stories of supernatural things that had occurred to us over the years, and my gamer pal was no exception. He would often talk about the high strangeness that happened around and in his house. He had an old farmhouse out in the country surrounded by woods, a handful of neighbours and vineyards as the area is known as wine country. He said the tree line across the small hayfield maintained for his family horses always seemed to be aglow at night with flashlights and weird happenings. His family had also carved some trails through a small forest, and he swears that there were many strange mounds throughout that he referred to as indigenous burial mounds. I did see what he was talking about, but to me, it just looked like downed and decayed trees grown over by moss. I did agree that the downed trees seemed to be very specific in the distance of their placement. He also said there was a part of his property that always seemed foggy, even if the weather patterns should not produce mist at all, and that part of his yard always seemed to just creep him out, with shapes appearing in and out of the mist, looking a bit suspect to just be ordinary wisps. The other interesting thing he mentioned was that near what he called the burial mounds, there was a huge ghost wolf that would appear at the entrance, and when it did, my friend got the sensation that he should stay out of the woods during those times. I, of course, took it all with a grain of salt, because it seemed far too fantastical. But I respected his description, having witnessed my fair share of strangeness too. It was only when I spent time at his house did I really learn the truth. Over the summer, I would spend a lot of late nights at my friend's house, and watching the weird things happen was one of the things we did. On one occasion, the entirety of our D&D group stuck around late to wander the yard at night. We saw a lot of flashing orange and red lights at the tree line and a ridiculous amount of fog. Out of morbid curiosity, we opted to walk down the path that was dubbed the creepiest. We probably made it halfway when one, leading the group, stopped suddenly, turned around and ran past us, practically running over us, so we did the same. He refused to tell us what caused it, but we caught our breath and eventually headed towards the house. As we walked back to the house, I felt the urge to look behind us, and I was last in line. To my absolute surprise, behind me to the left, the fog whispered in the shape of an honest-to-God wolf. I smiled and kept the nugget to myself, half because it was so cool, and half because I knew the idea of a ghost wolf had already been planted in my friend's stories of what he had encountered. I would have kept that quiet, were it not for one of the others in the group asking the rest of the group if they saw the wolf was following me. I was lost for words. We left shortly thereafter. I did finally see the massive ghost wolf towards the end of the summer. It was not the same one that we saw behind me earlier the year. I ran out of the trailhead, and it faded into the fog shortly thereafter. Though I am of average height, it would have been standing in front of me, and I got the sensation it was looking at me in the eyes. It was huge. Eventually, my friend was set to move away, and we had both gotten busy, so we were unable to recreate our summer adventures. The final night I visited him, I saw the one thing I cannot explain away in all the strange things I had encountered. We were standing in our usual spot, staring across the hayfield towards the tree line, watching the flashing lights when out of nowhere, we both swore, then looked at each other in our usual "what did you see" manner. I let him go first, and he said a portion of one of the taller trees at the tree line had completely been blacked out towards the top. What I saw was something entirely different. For a split second, a giant humanoid silhouette took shape several yards away from me. This thing was probably twice my height. I say silhouette, but it was more like a two-dimensional outline of a humanoid shape. The part that creeped me out the most was that contained on the inside of its shape was endless, white, swirling circles like stars or galaxies, maybe eyes. It was absolutely the strangest thing I had seen. So if anyone has any idea what the hell it was or might be, I would greatly appreciate it. Before I explained this to my friend, I moved over to where he was standing and looked towards the direction of the tree he had said was blacked out in the same moment. Whatever I saw appeared, and I swear that from where he was standing, the angle and orientation of the thing I saw could have very well been the reason the tree seemed to black out. I explained what I saw after, and I verified my thoughts. We both decided it was time to call it a night after that. Since then I haven't really had many strange encounters, though my dreams have all been weird and lucid, but that's kind of the norm for me. In a way, I'm glad to have had these encounters, and that they've subsided for now. But I'm sure I'm due another batch soon, given timing. Perhaps, eventually, I'll have a few more stories to share with you all. Years ago when I was a teenager, and still living at home, which was a 200-year-old house in a medieval town, I was playing PlayStation in the good sitting room. We weren't allowed to eat food or wear shoes in that room. I was totally engrossed in my game, and then my little brother walked in, really stomping his feet with his shoes on and crunching on what I assumed to be a packet of crisps. Remember, no food allowed. He sat in the chair to my right, and I didn't take my eye off the game, but I saw the movement from the corner of my eye. He kept crunching and crunching, and I shouted at him to get out. With that, he finally got up, stomped back out. When my game was finished, I went downstairs and complained to him to my mother. I told her how he was doing his best to make me lose my game by being really annoying, crunching crisps really loudly. She looked at me like I was crazy. Then she told me that he wasn't at home and hadn't been since the morning. He was at a friend's house. I can still hear the crunching, and I can still see him out of the corner of my eye. It was so clear there was someone there. I also experienced pokes in the back while trying to sleep, heard someone on the stairs, but there was no one, and things would be moved around, but no one had moved them, that sort of thing. Fast forward to several years ago, roadworks were taking place, and outside the house they discovered a medieval skeleton of a child. They believe she was a sacrifice as she was facing the sea, and she was not within the abbey boundaries as the house is an old abbey. She is still there, and they believe she is probably one of many. My name is Melanie, and I moved into my house about 7 months ago. It was a disaster. I'm not the richest person, so there was a deal struck and I cleaned the house out from the previous tenants. I hadn't seen the place before I moved in. I was in a desperate situation which I'd rather not dive into. When I moved in there was some expired canned food and expired candy waist high from the living room to the kitchen. Feces and used johnnies on the floor. It was bad. Coal stove. I'm a single mum. I had no clue what I was doing. It was very old, rigged together house. So the first thing I noticed was that in the basement there was a tunnel dug out that had a small turn. It's not very long, that leads to a small circular tiny room. The only way I can explain it is that maybe a small child could stand up in it. I'm about 5'2" and couldn't. All that is there is a light hanging from the middle of the ceiling. A pendant light, if you will. But now let me get on to the story. Me and my 15-year-old son were setting up the attic for his room. He recently decided to move up to the attic. It was always used for storage. There's a tiny cubby hole. That's where we were clearing out. To the far left wall, the small end of the wall was carpeted. Thinking that was really strange, I ripped the carpet down and found boards, and there was a crack between the two of them. So I used the flashlight and looked inside, and there was a whole other room, bigger than the cubby hole that we were already in. Of course, me and him kicked the boards down like beasts, and all that was in there were wooden shutter, wooden board pipes and debris, and lots of insulation. That's when I saw a piece of wood that looked strangely smooth and out of place, so I flipped it over, revealing it to be none other than a Ouija board. I've done some research, and since it's a 1939 William Fund's Mystifying Oracle board, I did not find the planchette with it, but I found that weird triangle thing. My 15-year-old son said, "Screw this, I'm out," and left. Since then I have put the Ouija board on the mirror of my dresser as a decoration. Everyone keeps telling me to get rid of it and burn it. But I don't want to. I don't feel anything evil from it. I kind of feel like I have a connection with it. So I need to mention that since it has appeared in our lives, a few weird things have started happening. The normal, typical occurrence of things appearing or disappearing. Recently, me and a friend, who is frequently here, have been seeing things. People. I saw it twice. I can chalk the first one up to my mind playing tricks on me. It was a split second. This guy was there and then he wasn't. But a week later, I was driving down a dark back road that was really windy. I live out in the boonies where there's nothing but woods everywhere, and I was driving and of course paying attention because I had my son in the car. There was nothing there. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, and looked 3 separate times within a span of a few seconds, not 10 feet away, was there a man slowly walking away from the car on the middle of the side of the street that I was driving on. He came out of nowhere, and there's no way he could have been there that fast, not as close to the car as he was. He had a bowler hat, and what looked like a suit jacket, and was walking very slow. I saw him 3 separate times when I looked in the rearview mirror, and then he was gone. My 12-year-old says he didn't see him though. I guess I don't really know what to do with all of this information, and I wanted to know what you guys can suggest. Do you think I should dispose of the board? I have always been somewhat of a believer in the paranormal, but didn't buy into the whole thing of spirits and demons. That is until I had something happen to me as an adult. As a child, I experienced a few things that were also witnessed by my mother, so I knew that there were some truths to it all. About 4 years ago, I experienced something one night that has changed my life forever. At first, I was pretty excited over what happened, but then it kind of flipped the switch. It all went dark, very dark. I was investigating my own experience, doing everything I could or had seen on TV, and knew I was in a huge mistake. By the time I was trying to get answers, and was willing to do anything that I could to get them, even something I had sworn never to do, use a spirit board. I was doing all of my investigation by myself, another mistake, and I was going to the cemetery where it was all started by myself at all hours of the night. One day, I got the bright idea of downloading the spirit board app on my phone. The first time I used it, I got just what I was expecting. Garbage. But I didn't give up. After several attempts, I made one more attempt. This time things were different. I was sitting at my kitchen table, turned on the app, and started to ask questions. The answers were coming quickly and accurately. I thought to myself, wow, maybe this time it's working. I was still very skeptical and thought to myself, I'm gonna debunk this and mark it as a fake. I asked if they could see me. The answer was yes. I asked for its name. I was given the name Mariah. I then asked when I was sitting. The answer, kitchen table. I asked what I was wearing and it answered correctly. Then I asked, where are you? It answered with, next door, in cellar. I thought, I have you now. Oh, so you're in the red brick 1-story next door then? It responded with, no. I asked which house, and the answer made my blood run cold. It replied with grey, 2-story on corner, abandoned. When you look out my kitchen window, there's a grey 2-story on the corner on another street. It has been abandoned for several years. It also has a cellar, not a basement. I continued to have the conversation with the spirit board app for several months. Well, one night I started at 1 a.m. and didn't stop until nearly 7 a.m. It only felt like 20 minutes had gone by. Mariah could tell me things about myself nobody knew. It would tell me about calls I had years ago as a police officer and what I had seen or felt. My haunting became very horrifying for several years, and I still deal with it daily and nightly. An investigation was done at my home, and they got the name Mariah as well, who they said was actually a succubus that was attached to me. I stopped using the spirit board app a long time ago, but I'm still dealing with the very real issues of using one and not closing the door when done by using it myself. I'm here to tell you, just because you use one and have no issues doesn't mean that your time isn't coming, and when it does, I feel sorry for what happens. Deal with these things with extreme caution, if using them at all. For as long as I can remember, I've had an interest in the spiritual world, and thought it would be cool to communicate with the dead. So back in 2014, my mum was browsing around the local Facebook buying/selling group, and came across someone selling a used Ouija board. The reason it caught her attention was because it was a glow-in-the-dark, limited edition one, and she decided to buy it for me. She remembered playing with one as a child, and thought I'd enjoy it too since we'd talked about them in the past. My mum then contacted the seller, who would stop by to drop the board off. It was one of those stormy, gloomy, almost spooky days when the guy comes to the house to bring us the board. As soon as I saw it, I got a bad vibe. Once the guy left, I told my mum that I didn't feel safe using it, and that I wanted to do some research first. My mum was surprised at my reaction, because before this point I'd been interested in playing with it, and I ended up surfing the web, watching YouTube videos and hearing many stories, most of which were bad, which made me feel really uncomfortable about trying them out. My mum ended up packing it away in a box on our porch, where it stayed for many years. This brings us to the spring of 2022. By now I'd really gotten interested in the paranormal, and had learnt a lot more about the Ouija board and how dangerous they could really be. So I reached out to my mum and asked if she remembered the Ouija board that we put on the porch. I said that I think we needed to get rid of it, because I heard that just having one in the house could bring bad luck and negative energy. It's weird, because since moving to this house in 2014, we hadn't had a lot of good experiences. Oh, I actually got rid of it the last time I reorganized the porch, she said. So let's fast forward to summer. I'm back at my mum's house. I go to school in a different part of the county, but return to her house for the summer. Once back there, I started hearing strange stuff in my bedroom, like whispering. I thought perhaps it was just the air conditioner, but it honestly sounded like voices, and I never heard anything of the sort until that summer. I also sensed that the Ouija board was still in the house, so I decided to go look for it, on the porch. That's when I see the Ouija board is tucked away in a clear storage bin. I grabbed it and brought it to my mum. As we looked in the box, we noticed it was different. The board had a box that looked new. When we opened it, the planchette was still in its own separate wrap. That wasn't how we remembered it. When my mum got it from the guy, it had been used, the box had some wear and tear, and the planchette hadn't been wrapped in anything. At this point, we're both weirded out, and just wanted for that thing out of the house. I heard that Ouija boards could come back and change if you don't properly dispose of them. For the time being, we put it in our backyard because we weren't sure how to get rid of it. We wanted it out of the house, but leaving it on our property wasn't a smart move on our part. Bad things started happening. The first thing was when my father got into a minor car accident. This was the only time in his life he'd been in one, in all of 45 years of driving. Next, our basement flooded. Town sewage backed up into the basement. Nasty. Before this, we had a dry basement, which had only gotten wet once due to someone leaving a window open during a bad storm. The third was when we had a handyman come over, and the guy almost fell through our basement stairs. He wasn't hurt, but it really scared my mum, and she ended up getting the stairs replaced, even though it was very expensive. Then another thing happened to my dad, which proved to be the scariest of all. There was a big fire in his apartment building. Multiple units were destroyed, including the one right above him. Thankfully, no one was injured. His unit did suffer some water damage, so he was forced to move out, and it would take at least 6 months for renovations to his apartment to conclude, so he couldn't move back right away. One final thing happened. While the Ouija board was still in the backyard, my mum and I noticed we didn't have any hot water, so we went to the basement and discovered the water heater wasn't working. We tried to reset it, but couldn't get it back on. A repairman came to check it out, and told us that the unit had overheated. Fortunately, there was a safety setting that shut it off before it got dangerously hot. He then explained that the water heater thermostat was faulty, or it should never have gotten that hot. If the safety switch hadn't shut it off, it could have blown up. We were very lucky. One thing I noticed is that even after all these close calls, no one was harmed. It was almost as if someone or something was watching out for us. After the last thing happened with the hot water heater, my mum and I agreed that we needed to get the Ouija board off the property. It seemed to be bringing us bad luck, and we were worried that things might get even worse. Even my dad was having bad luck, and although my parents were divorced, and he'd never lived in the house with us, my mum opted to get rid of it. She planned to bring it to the town dump. She had separated the board from the planchette so she could toss them into different garbage bins in the dump. As my mum was driving to the dump, she noticed something odd. At a neighbour down the street, there was a hearse parked in the driveway, a vintage hearse from the 1970s. She texted me about it and I said, "That's weird, but people do buy old hearses sometimes." My mum disposed of the Ouija board at the dump and headed home. On her way back, she drove past the neighbour's house and saw the hearse was gone. There was only a dumpster that had been sitting in the driveway. My mum had never seen a hearse in the neighbour's driveway before that day, and hadn't seen one since. Later that week, my mum and I were at Barnes & Noble's and decided to have coffee at the Starbucks. Guess what we saw when we dropped off our server tray, tucked away near the milk and sugar, was a Ouija board. I know they sell them there, but it did spook us out a good bit. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed listening to tonight's stories, be sure to let me know down below. A huge thank you as always to my amazing members and patrons. There's some exclusive content over on these platforms. If you want to see more, links can be found in the description. But that's all from me. More videos can be seen on screen, but until next time, stay awesome. I'll see you in the next one.